Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and today I am going to be talking about how to create change and not just any kind of change, but how to create lasting change in very large, humongous, slow moving, slow turning organizations. So, if this applies to you, I would love to know, how do you actually make this happen? How have you been successful or maybe even unsuccessful at creating organizational change, but also in particular, change that sticks? Because it's one thing, we've all gone through this. We go through one change management program to another. We go through a digital transformation, an HR transformation, and now the change du jour is a sustainability transformations. We're constantly going through these changes, but how often do they actually stick? So we're going to talk about that today, and I encourage you to please share your ideas and comments. Please say hello from wherever you're from, and then we'll get into it. So we know that turning big companies around is incredibly difficult because it's complex. There's lots of things going on. And some of the things that make it especially hard in large organizations is that people feel like, well, this is the way we've always done it. Uh, it's worked for us. I found this that when I've joined organizations or come into an organizations and I ask, well, why do you do things this way? Like, we've always done it this way. Why would we ever want to change it is the question. And so change is not something that happens because if it isn't broke, why should we change it? If it's clearly kind of working, but not at its optimal function, maybe we just leave it because changing it is going to be so difficult. There's also a sense in organizations that, this is a big boat and I'm not going to be able to make any change. If I go out there and try to make this change, nothing's going to happen. And I'm just going to get slapped on the wrist and say, get back in line, go back, put your head down, and don't try to change anything. But even if you're a leader, you may be thinking, well, there's safety in the numbers here because no one else is changing. Everyone is being promoted because they are staying safe, not taking risks and failing. So I'm just going to play it safe. So it's one of those things what we're going to talk about today about how do you actually create change. So I want to say hello to Jesney, Leonardo, our team is, and Leonardo. Again, so good to have you all here, coming from places like Brazil and Turkey. So great to have such an international audience. All right, so let's get into this. How do we create change? Well, if you've been a study of change, you of course have come across John Carter's 8 steps to creating change. So let's take a quick look at those. I'm going to make this a little bigger so you can see it. And these are classic ways to create change. Create urgency, put a team together, develop a vision of what kind of change you want to have, communicate the change, remove the obstacles, set short-term goals, keep the momentum going, and make sure that the change sticks. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, this has been in existence for decades. And it's not to say that it's not good, but it is very, very difficult to make happen. And in particular, the one area that I think is particularly difficult is making change stick. So why is this? Why is change so difficult to make happen? Well, first of all, you're assuming that this change, again, the time when Carter wrote this, it was, again, a lot of physical work being done. So how do you create change in a manufacturing process or a physical process? Well, you break it down into small things. You identify what the problems are, and you address these things in short order. You make a list of the things that are obstacles. You set short-term goals, and you make sure it happens. That doesn't necessarily happen, though, if a lot of the work is mental work, where you have to change mindsets. You have to change people's attitudes. That's a lot harder to identify. Well, is it really working? How do you change people's minds, not just their behaviors? So a lot of the problems that come and stem is that what kind of change are we creating? And in this new workforce, even if you're dealing with physical types of changes, the changes we're asking people to make are in thinking about how I make change. How do I even just change instead of doing things the same way, business as usual? I was working with an organization that did a lot of manufacturing, and I was talking to some of the plant leaders, and they were being asked for decades to do things in a way so that people stayed safe, that the plants kept operating, and that people didn't get hurt. So safety was the number one criteria and most important thing for those plant managers, because if things went wrong, people died. So now they're being asked to change, fail fast and fail smart. Like, no, failure is not an option here, really, because people die. And that mindset change, even though it was a physical plant, was something, again, that was very, very difficult for this organization to do. So the thing is that we assume that if you set the vision, that people are going to buy into it automatically. That if you and if you don't buy into that change, then you're not a team player. That you're just not seeing the vision. You don't have a winning attitude. And so the problem with this is that honestly, we've seen so many changes happening in these large organizations. This is not my first rodeo. This is my not my first time going through this, and we've seen so many change management fads go through, and most of them, are they really serious about this change? Well, I'm going to sit here and see if they're serious. Or do they give up after a few weeks, after a few months, lose attention, lose interest in this change initiative, and the leaders move on? This is the number one cause of change fatigue. Because do we really see the change actually happening? We buy into it once and we believe in the change and we invest in it, and then it doesn't happen. There's no payoff. I'm going to be skeptical the next time you come around and ask me to buy into the next change, into the next management fad. So, this is a difficult thing because if we don't believe something's actually going to change, we're never going to do it. So, one of the things that I find, especially when it comes to change, is that we have to think about what actually creates change. And it's processes and all these things, but in the end, it's our culture. What are the things that we actually see that are going to indicate this is a change we want to buy into? And so, one of the things I've studied is I try to keep things really simple. That if you want change to happen, and especially in your culture, then two things have to happen. Your beliefs have to change and your behaviors have to change. So if you believe that the culture is going to reward things, the company is going to reward you for certain behaviors, then you will act in a certain way. If you believe that success is defined in these ways, then you're going to act based on those beliefs. So if you don't believe, if you want to change the behaviors, if you want people to actually change the things they do, you have to change your beliefs. And one of the biggest changes that are needed, I think, in many ways, is how do you actually build trust? How do you build trust that this change that we want to have is actually real? It's going to happen. And we know that trust is probably the hardest ingredient to have. It's the hardest to build when it's most needed. And when you're trying to create change, it's usually because things aren't working well. So trust is at its all-time low. And you're asking people to trust in you now as a leader with this new vision, and that's just not going to happen. So, in many ways, this is going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If people don't feel safe, and last week I was talking about psychological safety, if people don't feel like their needs are being met, if they don't actually believe you, if they don't trust you, then they're not going to take that first step, that first really difficult step to trust and then to change. So, you really need to have some predictability and capabilities because these are things that create change, create trust. And so being predictable, saying this is what we anticipate is going to happen and setting expectations and then making sure they actually go through. And the second thing is, do we have the capability to actually make this change? Do we actually have the skills, the resources, the people, the time to make this happen? So this was really important for to be able to create that change. So to give you an example of an organization that I think did a really good job of this, let's take a look at Microsoft. So in 2014, Microsoft got a new CEO, Satya Nadella, and he was not the obvious choice. He was somewhere out in the organization running a lot of new technology projects, was in charge of search, was doing AI, a lot of really interesting things. And they plucked him from those projects and made him the CEO. And people are like, who is this guy? Where's he coming out of? And his challenge at that point, and he talks about it in his book, was that Microsoft just had a really competitive culture. There was very, very little trust. So he talks about this cartoon. I'll put it up here because I think it's a fascinating cartoon. You can see it here. It was a sort of a political a cartoon illustrating the types of cultures that people have. So they had in here places like Google, which is just a whole network mess. We have Apple, which is just Steve Jobs at the middle and everybody's around him. But take a look at Microsoft. And it was basically all these different teams in their little bubbles pointing guns at each other. It was a highly competitive organization. There was fundamentally no trust. And Satya Nadella said, how am I going to break this cycle? How am I going to pull the entire organization together to be able to make this happen? And so one of the things he did was to come up with a new mission. And it was to empower every person in every organization on the planet to achieve more. Pretty simple. But more importantly, it's how he showed up. If you've ever seen Satya Nadella talk, he is a highly empathetic person. He talked about empathy right from the very beginning, that we have to have empathy for each other, understand what the other person's pain points are, what makes them happy, what are they going through, standing in each other's shoes. And he did this to say to Microsoft, we have gotten away from what made us successful, which is to understand the needs of every single person, every organization on the planet to achieve more. So he really oriented everyone around empathy of the customer, but he also encouraged people internally to have empathy for each other. And he started doing this as an example of himself, how he would work with leaders, how he showed up, how he talked. It was with tremendous empathy and compassion and kindness in the way that he actually was showing up as a leader. And this is in great contrast to Steve Ballmer, who could be loud, bombastic, really demanding, not giving an inch. Such a contrast. And slowly but surely, what Microsoft did was to transform and to transform itself to be more focused on the customer and to also be focused on each other to build that trust. And the changes have been incredible. The employees started seeing this in their leaders and seeing it in themselves and really, truly believing that this could be possible. And when the beliefs started to change, when they could see the behavior changing, the leaders, the beliefs were changing. And again, this goes back to what I showed before, is that this becomes a virtual cycle, that you have to be able to change your beliefs and then change your behaviors. So if you think about the ways that change happens, then it really does start with the leaders. And it has to be with the leaders starting and seeing that change. And so this is the thing I think that's often been missing. When leaders say, let's create the change, let's talk about how the organization needs to change. And we talk about all the things that the organization is not doing right. We want this change to happen. And in the end, when I work with organizations, I go back to the leadership and I go, how are you changing? How are you adapting and changing to this change? And so I like to say that in particular, that if you're not being part of the change, then you're part of the problem. And especially for leaders, and I worked with this one organization, I'll tell you how they worked on this. What we really did was we have to figure out how this leadership group wanted to be as individuals and also with each other. They needed to establish that trust, how they wanted to be before they could decide what they were going to do. And I find that we oftentimes move into a change management or a transformation project way too soon because we haven't done that hard work of deciding how we want to be. In the belief and the being part always goes back to the beliefs, to what you want to be here today, how you are today, having a realistic idea of where you're starting from and then where you want to go. So I'm going to take a look at some of the comments here. I see a bunch of them coming in. And then I'll talk about this example of a client that I worked with during this. So just a couple more hellos. We have Arun coming from India, Jacques from Germany, Paul from Frisco, Texas. Thanks for stopping by. And we have some people coming back again. Jay, always great to see you. What he writes about how he makes change stick is strong communication plans to keep employees up to date with what is taking place. Thank you so much, Jay. We'll talk about how important communications are. And I would love to talk a little bit more detailed into what goes into those communications later when we talk about actions. Lynn, good to see you. Here's something that you shared. Anything that you do that shapes how people think and act, again, beliefs and behaviors is shaping culture. So true. When you make those influences customer-centric, you win on so many levels. Any customer experience and employee experience manager can help shape culture by the way they share the voice of the customer and the voice of the employee in engaging ways with each work group. So thank you so much, Lynn. I think it's so great to, again, emphasize the focus on the employees, focus on the customers, the people who you are trying to do this change for. It gives you that sense of purpose again. So such a great point to make. And Jay says, yes, that is a Gap and Void cartoons. Always so good to see those too. And then Marissa's share, so good to see you, Marissa. Begin with small changes, trial possibilities, and offer options for final goals. We'll definitely talk about that. Again, it's hard to create huge amounts of change. It's actually small little steps that go along the way. So thank you, Marissa, for sharing that. I would love to, again, to just keep the ideas, questions, comments that you have going into this. So let me give you an example of an organization that I was working with recently. This company wanted to create a big culture change. And they asked me to come in to do a workshop with the top leaders. And they were looking for a very specific strategy, getting from where they are today to where they want to be in the future. And then also put together a work plan of how they're going to execute this. And they were very clear, don't want this to be like months and months and months, a year long. We need to make this change as quickly as possible. So we want to come out of this multi-day workshop with a work plan. I'm like, okay, great. So we started with just identifying what that change was going to be. But rather than just creating a vision statement, we wrote a manifesto. And I have some other live streams and articles about how to write a manifesto. And it's more than just a vision, it's a document that says, we believe this, and therefore we're going to take these actions. Again, you can see it being linked back to beliefs and the behaviors that we're going to take. So it's really detailed in saying, this is what we want to believe now, not these old ways of thinking. We're going to think in these new ways. Because when you can identify the new beliefs, and by that action, say what the old beliefs are that we've identified that we don't want to believe anymore, it's one thing to say we don't want to do things, but what will we do instead? What will we believe instead? Because if you leave any bit of that old belief around, it will stick around and gunk things up. And so you got to make sure that those old beliefs have no place anymore in your new culture. So we started with a manifesto. So we spent the first day really crafting that out, identifying the old beliefs that were no longer serving the organization, and identifying new beliefs that would serve them. So identify those beliefs and the behaviors. Everyone's really happy. Great manifesto that they could use for themselves as a unifying and alignment tool, but also to take back to their organizations. The next day, we came back and I said, okay, today we're going to work on the work plan. They go, okay, great. Let's whiteboard it out, brainstorm all the ideas. And I went, no, you're going to go off. You're going to take that manifesto and think about the change you want to see in your organization. And what are the biggest things that need to change in your organization in particular? Which parts of this manifesto are most important to you? And then think about the one thing that you, as a leader, need to change. The one belief that you need to change, and more importantly, the one behavior that you're going to change. The one thing you're going to do very, very differently to signal that this change is real. So they went off, created those things, put them on cards. And we asked them, what's the biggest bang can you get? How are you going to communicate this change? And also very specifically, what do you expect to happen over a period of time? In this case, it was just for the next month. What do you expect to see happen to know and give you evidence that this change is actually happening? So we put that on the board, all these cards, everybody filled it out, put all these cards up on the board, about 15 or so. And we looked at those things, agreed to it, created some accountability. I said, that's your work plan. And they went, that's not a work plan. They said, that's just the things that we're going to do. And I'm like, exactly, that's your work plan. Because the thing I wanted to impress on them is that if they only created plans that the organization was going to do and not the plans that they were going to do individually, the change would never happen. Again, trust was at an all-time low. They needed this culture change. It wasn't functioning. And so they needed to establish credibility. They needed to establish predictability that over this next month, they were going to show up and do this new behavior constantly over and over and over again. And as they communicated this change back into the organization, they were also going to set the expectations that everybody else was going to behave and believe these new ways of thinking, behave in this new way too, set as an example by them modeling this new behavior. And they would actually be able to see what that change would look like. And this is a really interesting point because when they could see that this was actually a really simple way to do it, in that they were communicating the expectations that they were asking the next layer of leaders to also start behaving in this way. And very importantly, the leaders in that room were making a pledge to not accept the old behaviors. They were going to say, this is the way we're going to behave. I am doing this. Everyone else is going to do this also. And every time the old behaviors, the old beliefs showed up, they would say, no, no, remember? We said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to do this instead. So I share this because it's so important to be able to talk about how this change is going to stick. And it needs to start with the leaders, because if you do not believe the leaders are serious about this, see the change happening in them, why should I do this? So I want to go and see if there's any questions that you may have. Okay, so I don't see any right now, but let me know if you have any questions around this, because it seems so simple. But at the same time, I've done this several times now with organizations. And what was interesting, this organization came back in a month and said it's absolutely working. And they took it to their next level of leaders, the next 300 people in the organization, brought them all together and did this whole thing again and asked them to actually run the session. These leaders, again, went through the manifesto, got commitments from each of these leaders about the one thing they were going to change in their organization. So in the period of just one quarter, just 12 weeks, they could see and measure tremendous change in the organization through the behaviors of the people. The old beliefs were starting to fade away. These new beliefs were coming up. The manifesto was being used and talked about. They had not just it on the walls and videos, but people were actually sharing their stories about how this new behavior, these new beliefs were changing the way that they were working. So it is possible. It is absolutely possible to start creating these types of changes in an organizations. But it's only possible if you identify the old beliefs and give them no new space to live. Todd has this great point. Old beliefs can be hard to change. And it's true because they kept us safe. They kept us profitable. They really served us for a very, very long time. But at some point, we now think that those old beliefs are holding us back. And so we can do sort of a Maria Kondo thing of clearing out your old beliefs. We love this belief. It served us, and we can say thank you to it. But now we're going to set it aside because it doesn't serve us anymore. And instead, we're going to take on these new beliefs, and we're going to adapt them too as well. So one thing, Todd, in particular, that I found very interesting with this organization is they had these sort of like going away ceremonies for these old beliefs. They gave credence. They say, yeah, we absolutely love this old belief. It served us really well, but now we're going on this new one. And one thing in particular is that the belief has to happen in accordance with this belief that the world is not working. And this goes to a question that someone has. I'm sorry I don't have your name on my panel here. How do you create urgency with a very large, successful organization? Why change when you're already successful? I'm sorry, it's Lisa from Virginia. Thank you, Lisa. And that's such a great question. Again, people need to see the urgency and the reason why it's not failing. This is why Marissa's comments about Lynn's comments about the voice of the customer is so important. When you hear from your customers that the things that you're doing are no longer working, that is probably the most galvanizing force that you can have. Hey, don't believe me as a leader. Believe our customers who are saying this out there. And so bringing in customers, or even better, taking your people out to the customers, actually doing visits with them, being able to see videos of them in their home situation, in their offices, if you're a B2B business, really brings to life what those changes need to happen inside the organization. You need to be able to make that case. All right, so one of the things that I want to go through again is just talk about how do you actually do this. So action number one, start with your leaders. And in some cases, that may be yourself. So, and make this really personal. Again, one of the things we often talk about is, this is about work. It's not personal. We leave emotions behind. For you to share how hard this is, why it's important to you. Talk about the feelings and the emotions, and to acknowledge This is really hard. It is so important to do because if you don't do this, people are thinking, well, it's easy for them, but it's hard for me. Why is it so hard for me when it's easy for them? The more you can be transparent about how hard it is for you personally, the more people will say, oh, okay, good. I'm not alone here. And you can talk about how you work through it and be okay with that. And so I think about this as being able to live in what I call the messy middle. So some of you may have seen this. Again, knowing that change is hard, acknowledging it, like going from here, we're leaving the safety of what we know and going to this future that we don't know very well. It's going to be this pretty messy journey. But for people to know that you're in it with them brings some modicum of comfort, I guess, in some ways. Like there's knowing that we're all suffering together in this, but it's worth it because this change is really important for us to go through. But to let people know that you're not alone. That's the first thing. Start with leaders and make it personal. Explain to people, yeah, this is hard and this is how I'm going to talk about it. One of the this organization that I was working with, one of the things we identified that was a problem was that the top leader, the CEO, uh, was one of these people that he saw his role as being a cheerleader. So it was like, come on, we got to go do this change because our customers are demanding it. And anytime somebody came in and said, well, what about these problems? He was like, no, you're just not being positive. You've got to have a winning attitude. And it got to the point where it was toxic. His positivity was toxic because people didn't believe him anymore. And when he realized this was happening, he realized, oh, I need to go do something very different. So one of the things they wanted to do was, and so he changed his tone. He said, I know this is difficult. And he started really listening to people. The credibility, the expectations started to change. So the thing here is that you can allow people to have what I call be visiting pity city for a little bit. But we can say like, yeah, this is really hard. Spend some dedicated time, maybe at the beginning of the meetings, like, so how's the week going? And allow people to share, yeah, it was hard. This week was challenging. But then also switch it to say, but what worked? What were our successes? What are our wins? And then for people to share that too. I saw this one great idea. It's like allow Pity City to be real. Allow people to go visit Pity City, have pity for themselves, feel bad, feel sorry for themselves for a little bit, but don't allow them to move in. You can go visit it, let it out, but then we need to come back and focus on where we're going, on our final destination, which is this vision of success. So leading people through this messy middle, allowing us to have a little bit of pity for ourselves to say, God, this is really hard, and then move on. The last part here I want to talk about is the communication plan. I saw before that that the key thing around communication is that the importance of narratives and of stories. I love the some of the materials from Chip and Dan Heath. One of the things that they talk about, they have this great book called Made to Stick, and how do ideas stick? And change ideas are one of the great examples that they have. And they have this acronym called SUCCESS. And I love the last two about being emotional, because when you're emotional, it helps people see how meaningful this is to you. But also stories. Stories are so important. And in particular, the narratives that you create. So it's not just one story that you tell over and over again. It's this arc of a story. It's a narrative. And what's beautiful about that, it allows people to write their own stories on top of that narrative. So when you're thinking about your communication plan, communicating this in a deep and urgent way. And I think it's so important that we talk about the communications. So Jay was talking again about how communication plans are important, but it's also what are the things that you communicate? And the narratives are so important. Like you can tell a story about why you believe this is the right thing to do. How is your personal experience tied to this new belief? And for other people, encouraging them to tie their own stories, their own experiences, and to share their experiences. Because people remember stories. They don't remember data points. They don't remember all the examples, but they remember stories because they have an emotional arc to it. So I encourage you to think about how to create change by starting with yourself, starting with how you want to change your own beliefs and behaviors. Just pick one thing, map it back to your vision and your manifesto, and then be able to create that change. All right, I have a couple other comments here. So, question from our team is, and that is, how do you measure change? As you mentioned, it's that's a great question. So, if one of the things that this organization that I was talking to, they wanted people to be able to feel more comfortable coming forward with ideas, because again, people in the past were told you don't have permission to talk. They believed that if you kept your mouth shut and you just did your job, you would rise up in the organization. And they wanted to put different types of beliefs in and start rewarding people for coming up with new ideas and ways to improve things, no matter how small or how big. So they started creating incentive structures, both real in terms of money, but also in terms of recognition incentives too, as well. And they measured, first of all, if people were actually doing this, were people coming forward more, were new ideas coming up, were people raising their hands and saying, I have an idea, I'm not quite sure, but maybe we should try this. And they measured and documented and had a formal way for people to do this. And they also asked leaders to change their behaviors in meetings to actually encourage people to voice their opinions on things. In many ways, this is the one thing that many of the leaders took on as the one change they wanted to have is they changed their meetings. They said, I'm not going to be the person coming up with all the answers anymore. I'm going to ask people to come up with the answers. So they measured this and they tracked it and they promoted it and showed it and gave rewards to this. And it started to fundamentally change the way things were going. Let's see. Have another question here from Leonardo. What's your opinion about the leadership on the future? Do you believe that we have a lot of true leaders? Actually, Leonardo, the reason why I focus so much on leadership in my work is because I don't think we have enough leaders. We have a lot of managers who maintain the status quo, and we need leaders who are able to and willing to create change. So a lot of my work is around what leadership looks like and how we need to become better leaders. So do I think that we have a lot of good leaders? We have some, and we have some amazing leaders out there, and we have a lot of really good managers. But we need a lot more leaders to create the kind of change we want to see in this world. Jay has this one point. James Champion, I'm not sure who James Champion is, admitted towards the end of life that often changes don't take place because of resistance at the top. And so he talked about, again, in democracy and self-agency is the next part in progression. So Jay, we talked a lot about agency and the need for people to see that change was possible in of themselves rather than waiting for somebody over there to empower them. So that's a great point. And I think, again, with leaders who are really good at this, the type of change they have to make are ones that are allowing other people to see themselves as leaders and as change. So great point to make, Jay. Thank you for that. Some other great comments. I want to make sure we get to some of them. Marissa, sometimes it's obvious the rut exists, but it can be difficult to redirect old school thought processes. Involving those who've held the line and arriving at incremental changes is vital to bring along long-term goals. Marissa, you're talking about that sort of frozen middle, the tundra of this, the middle management sometimes, who their entire lives have been the gatekeepers, the keepers of the process, the keepers of the status quo. And unless we bring them along the way, it's going to be really difficult. So you make a really good point. I think I'll make this, I've talked about it in the past, but it's been a while, but maybe we can go back and explore this as a topic. And how do you actually dig into that space? Because oftentimes when you hear change happening, the top leaders, top 2 or 3 leaders levels absolutely believe it. The bottom 2 or 3 levels absolutely believe it. But this middle frozen tundra of middle management see themselves as the keepers of that. Because if we're not going to do this anymore, then what does it mean for me? How do I define myself? And the way that I have seen that this change, instead of seeing themselves as gatekeepers, we flip their role to becoming facilitators of this change. It's a long and hard process, and we'll dig into that at some future episode. So thank you for bringing that up. And Lynn agrees with Marissa. It's hard to change mindsets since they're drinking the Kool-Aid, and unaware of the shortcomings and too vested in their current paths. Thank you so much for that, Lynn, for that reinforcement. This is a challenge of creating change. And the reason, again, why beliefs are so important, because if they challenge your fundamental beliefs, these new beliefs, for example, that my job here is to make sure things happen, and that's not going to happen anymore, then what's my job going to be? These are key things that we have to think about. So, thank you again, everyone, for joining today. I really appreciate you sticking with me, and especially all the great comments. This live stream wouldn't be the same without you being here. So, I hope to see you next week. And I'm going to talk about, again, making this even more personal because one of the biggest problems I see in change is people say, well, we're going to do something, we're going to make this change happen. But where's the me in this? What am I going to do? So we'll dig a little deeper into how do you actually make that change personal as leaders, as members of leadership teams. How do we get to that point? Because it is so, so difficult to do. So thank you so much, everyone, again for joining. I will see you next week. And until then, have a great week creating the change that you want to see. Thanks.